The night air over the Nile River was still cool when the first sounds of waking life began to move through the dark. Long before the golden edge of the sun appeared beyond the eastern desert, small lamps already flickered inside mud brick homes beside the water. Thin smoke drifted slowly upward into the quiet sky. Somewhere far away, a donkey shifted its weight in the darkness. Sand moved softly beneath tired feet. A fisherman coughed into the cold morning air while untangling his nets beside the riverbank. Ancient Egypt often woke before sunrise because the land itself demanded it. The heat would come later. By midday, the sunlight over the river valleys could feel heavy and endless. Stone walls trapped warmth. Open fields shimmered beneath white light. Workers carrying baskets of grain or stone grew tired quickly beneath the burning sky. Farmers guiding wooden plows through damp earth could feel sweat soaking through linen clothing before the morning had fully passed. Bakers stood beside ovens that glowed like small furnaces. Builders climbed ramps beneath a sun that never seemed to rest. So people learned to rise early. The quiet hours before dawn became some of the most important moments of the entire day. In small homes near the Nile, families slowly stirred awake while stars still lingered overhead. Most homes were simple. Their walls were made from sun-dried mud bricks mixed with straw and clay from the riverbanks. Roofs were flat and often used for sleeping during the hottest months of the year. Floors were packed earth. Sometimes woven reed mats covered the ground where people rested during the night. The darkness inside these homes was soft and deep before sunrise. A mother might be the first to wake. She would sit quietly for a moment, listening to the slow breathing of sleeping children nearby. The air carried the smell of clay, dust, smoke, and river water drifting through narrow streets outside. In one corner of the room stood baskets of grain. Nearby rested simple pottery jars filled with water collected the evening before. A low wooden stool sat beside a grinding stone worn smooth by years of use. The woman would light a small oil lamp. Its glow trembled gently against the walls. Outside, the village remained mostly silent except for the distant sound of sandals brushing against dirt paths somewhere. Another household was already awake. Somewhere, a baker had begun preparing dough before the heat of the day arrived. Ancient Egyptian mornings were deeply connected to work. Nearly every task became easier before the full strength of the sun covered the land. Farmers knew this well. So did fishermen, builders, potters, servants, herders, and boatmen. Their lives moved with the rhythm of light and temperature. The Nile itself shaped these rhythms. Each year the river flooded the fields, leaving behind rich black soil that allowed crops to grow in the middle of dry desert land. But farming required careful attention and endless labor. Irrigation canals needed repair. Water had to be carried by hand. Grain needed grinding. Animals needed feeding before the day became too hot. So the hours before sunrise felt precious. Along the riverbanks, fishermen prepared their small wooden boats while darkness still covered the water. The Nile at this hour seemed calm and endless. Reeds swayed quietly near the shore. Water birds rested silently among the marshes. The river reflected pale stars above like broken silver. Some fishermen worked alone. Others moved quietly beside brothers, sons, or fathers. They checked woven nets by touch more than sight. Fingers rough from years of labor untangled knots in silence. Sometimes they whispered softly to one another, their voices low and tired from many early mornings exactly like this one. The boats drifted gently into the dark current. Farther inland, farmers began walking toward the fields carrying wooden tools across their shoulders. The ground beneath their sandals still held traces of coolness from the night. This would not last long. They knew the heat would rise quickly after sunrise. Most ordinary Egyptians lived very hard lives. Many woke before dawn not because they wanted to, but because survival depended on careful use of time and energy. Heat could slow the body. Bright afternoon sunlight drained strength from workers already exhausted by physical labor. Early morning became the safest and most manageable time for many important tasks. Even the wealthier homes of Egypt woke early. Servants inside larger houses moved quietly through courtyards before daylight. Water jars were filled. Floors were swept clean with reed brushes. Bread ovens were prepared. In kitchens, grain was crushed into flour by women kneeling beside grinding stones. The steady sound of stone against grain became one of the first sounds of morning throughout many Egyptian towns. The work was slow and repetitive. Back and shoulders often ached from long hours bent forward. Fine dust from crushed grain clung to skin and clothing. Yet this labor had to begin early because bread formed the center of daily life in ancient Egypt. Workers carried bread into fields. Boatmen ate bread beside the river. Children dipped bread into stews. Builders resting near stone blocks shared bread beneath scraps of shade. As the eastern sky slowly paled, more movement appeared in narrow streets. Goats wandered between homes. A child carried water in a clay jar almost too large for his small arms. An old man adjusted bundles of reeds tied to a donkey's back. Somewhere nearby, someone coughed heavily in the dusty morning air. The smells of the waking city slowly gathered together. Smoke from cooking fires drifted above rooftops. Fresh bread baked inside clay ovens. River mud and wet reeds carried their own earthy scent from the nearby Nile. Fish from yesterday's catch lingered in baskets near the docks. Human sweat mixed with dust in the warming air. The ancient world did not move quickly. Even during busy mornings, there was a steady rhythm to life. People understood their routines deeply because they repeated them every day, season after season, year after year. The rising sun shaped nearly every action. Priests inside temple complexes also rose before sunrise. For them, the early morning carried spiritual meaning as well as practical importance. In temples dedicated to the gods, priests purified themselves with water before performing rituals. Long hallways remained cool and shadowed during these hours. Stone floors beneath bare feet still held traces of nighttime cold. Inside sacred chambers, lamps flickered softly beside statues of the gods. The priests believed the rising sun carried powerful meaning connected to rebirth and renewal. Each dawn reminded Egyptians of the endless cycle of life, death, and return. The sun god Ra traveled across the sky each day before descending again into darkness each night. Morning symbolized his return from the underworld. So while workers prepared for labor, priests prepared for prayer. The sounds of these different lives slowly blended together across Egypt's waking towns and villages. Near larger cities, scribes also began their day early. Though their lives were often more comfortable than farmers or laborers, they too depended on the cooler morning hours for concentration and work. Scribes copied records onto papyrus, tracked grain supplies, calculated taxes, and documented shipments moving along the Nile. Inside administrative buildings, reed pens scratched softly against papyrus scrolls while sunlight slowly entered through narrow openings. Scribes often worked sitting cross-legged on the floor with pallets resting nearby. Black and red ink waited in small containers. Their fingers became stained from constant writing. Though they escaped much of the physical hardship faced by builders and farmers, their days still began early and stretched long into the afternoon. Outside the cities, the desert itself slowly changed color with approaching dawn. At first the horizon appeared gray and pale blue. Then soft bands of gold emerged above distant cliffs. Sand and stone caught the first weak light while the Nile Valley still rested in shadow. For workers already awake, these moments could feel strangely peaceful. Before the noise of crowded markets and labor filled the day, there existed a short quiet period where the world seemed softer. Boats drifted silently through morning mist. Palm trees moved gently in the breeze. Water reflected fading stars. Then slowly the sun appeared. Its first light touched temple walls, mud brick homes, fishing boats, and open fields. The coolness of night began disappearing almost immediately. Now the true work of the day began. In farming villages, men moved oxen into fields while women prepared food for long hours ahead. Children gathered reeds, fetched water, or helped carry baskets. Elderly family members sat in shaded areas repairing tools or sorting grain. Labor never fully stopped in ancient Egypt. There was always another task waiting. Fields required planting, harvesting, watering, repairing. Boats needed cleaning. Nets needed weaving. Homes needed maintenance after seasonal flooding. Clothing needed washing by the riverbanks. Bread needed baking again and again each day. Waking before sunrise allowed people to begin these endless duties before exhaustion fully settled into the body. Builders working on tombs, temples, and monuments especially depended on early mornings. Large stone projects demanded enormous human effort. Teams of workers hauled limestone blocks across rough ground using ropes and wooden sledges. Others carved stone beneath open skies where sunlight reflected painfully from pale surfaces. The earlier they started, the better. At construction sites, laborers often gathered while the world still felt half asleep. Supervisors counted workers. Tools were distributed. Water jars were prepared carefully because dehydration remained a constant danger beneath the Egyptian sun. The lives of these workers were physically difficult. Many suffered from sore joints, damaged backs, worn teeth, and illness caused by dust or poor nutrition. Medical knowledge existed in ancient Egypt, but ordinary laborers rarely enjoyed comfort. Their bodies aged quickly beneath years of repetitive work. And still they woke before sunrise. Not because the mornings were easy, but because the afternoons became harder. Along the Nile docks, merchants organized goods arriving from distant regions. Crates of grain, pottery, papyrus, linen, fish, and oils moved between boats and storehouses. Workers carried heavy loads balanced across their shoulders while supervisors shouted instructions through the growing noise. The river served as Egypt's great highway. Nearly everything moved along its waters. Morning activity along the docks became intense before temperatures rose too high. Boatmen understood the changing winds and currents well. They watched the sky carefully while preparing journeys north or south along the river. Nearby, market sellers slowly arranged their goods beneath woven coverings that offered little protection from the coming heat. Fruits, vegetables, fish, sandals, pottery, baskets, and cloth filled crowded stalls. Soon the markets would grow loud. But early morning still carried traces of quiet. The first customers spoke softly. Dust drifted lazily through narrow streets. Sunlight stretched long shadows across stone walls and packed earth roads. Animals also followed the rhythm of early waking. Donkeys brayed impatiently as loads were tied to their backs. Geese wandered noisily near homes and canals. Dogs slept beneath carts until activity forced them awake. Oxen moved slowly toward fields where long hours of labor waited. The entire world of ancient Egypt rose together with the sun. And yet many people were already tired before daylight fully arrived. Sleep itself was often imperfect. Ordinary homes could become extremely hot during certain seasons, making rest difficult. Mosquitoes buzzed near the riverbanks. Babies cried during the night. Animals made noise nearby. Families slept close together on mats or simple beds made from wood and woven fibers. Many workers likely lived in a near constant state of exhaustion. Still, daily responsibilities never paused for tiredness. The morning routines continued endlessly. Women ground grain into flour while children rubbed sleep from their eyes. Men adjusted rough linen clothing before walking toward fields or workshops. Water carriers balanced jars carefully through crowded streets. Fishermen returned from the river with fresh catches glistening in early light. The sun climbed higher. Heat slowly thickened the air. And the reason for waking before sunrise became clearer with every passing hour. By late morning, stone walls already radiated warmth. Open ground reflected sunlight upward into the faces of workers. Shade became precious. Water jars emptied quickly. Sweat darkened linen garments. The desert surrounding the Nile Valley seemed almost motionless beneath the growing brightness. Inside workshops, craftsmen continued their labor despite rising heat. Potters shaped clay beside spinning wheels. Carpenters carved wood imported from distant lands. Metal workers hammered copper and bronze while furnaces glowed nearby. These spaces became painfully warm as the day progressed. So many craftsmen preferred to begin their most demanding tasks during the cooler morning hours. The body simply functioned better before midday. In wealthier homes, servants carried large jars of water to help cool rooms. Curtains blocked harsh sunlight from entering inner spaces. But ordinary workers rarely enjoyed such comfort. Most simply endured the heat as best they could. And so ancient Egyptian life slowly organized itself around the sun. Wake early. Work early. Rest when possible during the hottest hours. Then continue again until darkness returned. As morning moved closer toward noon, tiredness settled more heavily over the land. Farmers paused briefly beneath palm trees or simple coverings made from reeds. Boatmen wiped sweat from their faces while securing ropes along riverbanks. Bakers removed endless rounds of bread from ovens that filled rooms with suffocating warmth. The smell of hot dust now drifted through streets and fields alike. Children moved more slowly beneath the blazing sky. Even animals searched for shade. But before dawn, the world had felt different. Cooler. Quieter. More manageable. This was why ancient Egyptians woke before sunrise. Not simply from habit. Not only from tradition. But because the land itself taught them to do so generation after generation beneath the endless rhythm of the Nile and the rising sun. And as the bright day stretched onward across fields, temples, workshops, and crowded riverbanks, many already looked forward quietly to evening, when the heat would soften again, and darkness would slowly return over the calm waters of the Nile. As the morning slowly deepened across the Nile Valley, the early coolness disappeared from the earth almost completely. The pale softness of dawn gave way to a brighter and heavier light that settled over rooftops, fields, and temple walls. Dust rose from busy roads and lingered in the warm air. The river shimmered beneath the growing sun, its surface moving slowly beside thick clusters of reeds. By this hour, much of Egypt had already been awake for a long time. For many workers, the hardest labor began before the sun reached its full strength. They had learned over centuries that the body could endure more during the quiet hours before the heat spread across the land. Morning work carried its own rhythm. It was steady, familiar, and often exhausting, yet it remained easier than struggling beneath the harsh brightness of midday. In farming villages beside the Nile, the fields had become fully alive. Men guided oxen through wet soil, darkened by river water. Wooden plows scraped slowly through the earth while insects buzzed lazily nearby. Farmers bent low beneath, The warming sky, their feet sinking slightly into damp ground. Their linen clothing clung to their skin with sweat. Some carried baskets filled with seed grain balanced carefully against their hips. The sounds of labor traveled softly through the open fields. The creaking of wooden tools. The distant calls of workers. The slow movement of animals. The splash of water lifted from canals. Nothing moved quickly. Ancient farming depended less on speed and more on endurance. A farmer might repeat the same motion thousands of times in a single day beneath the open sky. Kneeling. Lifting. Pulling. Carrying. Digging. The body learned these movements from childhood and continued them into old age. Children often joined this labor early in life. A young boy might walk beside his father carrying small tools or water jars. A girl might help gather vegetables or pull weeds from irrigation channels. Their feet toughened against rough ground long before adulthood. Their skin darkened beneath endless sunlight. They learned the seasons of the Nile almost as naturally as breathing. And always the mornings began early. The river itself never truly slept. Boat traffic increased steadily after sunrise. Narrow wooden vessels drifted between villages carrying grain, fish, pottery, reeds, stone, and people. Sailcloth fluttered gently whenever the wind rose above the water. Oars dipped rhythmically into the river beside fishermen returning from early catches. Some boats carried government officials or scribes traveling between towns. Others transported laborers toward building sites farther north or south along the Nile. Many passengers sat silently during these journeys, conserving energy for the long day ahead. The smell of river mud mixed with fish, wet rope, damp wood, and human sweat. At crowded docks, workers unloaded cargo beneath the rising heat. Clay jars bumped against one another as they were carried inland. Sacks of grain shifted across bent shoulders. Supervisors kept records while scribes sat nearby with papyrus and reed pens balanced carefully in their hands. The scribes themselves often lived more comfortable lives than ordinary laborers, yet their days also demanded discipline and early waking. Inside shaded administrative buildings, they tracked harvests, counted supplies, recorded taxes, and copied official orders. Some worked within temples. Others served wealthy estates or royal projects. Most spent long hours seated cross-legged on floors or low stools, writing carefully while daylight entered through narrow windows. Even this quieter work became difficult during the hottest part of the day. Ink dried quickly in the heat. Sweat gathered beneath linen garments. The heavy air slowed concentration. So scribes often completed their most careful writing during the earlier hours when the world still felt calm. Beyond the river valleys, the desert watched silently. Long cliffs of pale stone stood motionless beneath the widening sky. Dry winds moved across empty sand. The contrast between the fertile Nile and the endless desert shaped nearly every part of Egyptian life. Water meant survival. Shade meant relief. Morning meant opportunity. Without the Nile, there would have been little life here at all. The river determined planting seasons, trade routes, food supplies, and daily schedules. It also influenced sleeping patterns. People woke early because the river economy demanded it. Fishing boats departed before dawn. Irrigation work began at first light. Crops needed attention before temperatures became dangerous. Near one village farther south, an elderly fisherman sat repairing nets outside his small home. His fingers moved slowly through tangled fibers worn thin from years in the water. Beside him rested a woven basket still damp from the morning catch. Flies drifted lazily through the air nearby. His face showed the marks of long labor. Deep lines around the eyes. Sun-darkened skin. hands roughened by rope, water, and time. He had likely risen before sunrise almost every day of his life. Many elderly Egyptians carried the same quiet exhaustion in their bodies. Years of physical work beneath intense heat often left joints stiff and backs bent forward. Teeth wore down from coarse bread filled with tiny grains of sand from grinding stones. Eyes struggled against dust and sunlight. Yet work rarely stopped completely with age. Families depended on every member. Even those too old for hard labor often repaired tools, watched children, prepared food, or sorted grain inside shaded courtyards. Inside homes during late morning, women continued endless domestic routines. One woman knelt beside a grinding stone, pushing grain back and forth beneath the weight of heavy stone tools. Fine dust coated her hands and arms. Nearby, flat rounds of dough rested on wooden boards before baking. A child slept quietly against the wall while another carried water from a nearby canal. The home smelled of warm bread and smoke. Outside, sunlight pressed harder against the mud brick walls. Most homes offered only limited relief from the heat. Small windows reduced sunlight but also restricted airflow. Roofs absorbed warmth throughout the day. During summer months, indoor spaces could feel heavy and airless by afternoon. This was another reason Egyptians valued the early morning. It was the gentlest part of the day. In wealthier neighborhoods near larger cities, servants moved carefully through shaded courtyards carrying jars of cool water or trays of food. Palm trees swayed above pools designed to soften the heat. Linen curtains stirred faintly in the dry breeze. Yet even the rich could not escape the Egyptian sun entirely. The climate shaped everyone's routines, whether noble or laborer. Farther north, near a large stone construction site, teams of workers hauled limestone blocks beneath the growing brightness. Their supervisors urged them onward while dust covered their legs and sandals. Sweat rolled down their backs as ropes tightened against their shoulders. These workers often lived in simple housing near construction zones. Their days began in darkness and ended long after sunset. Some built tombs for nobles. Others carved temple walls or transported stone from distant quarries. The labor required enormous coordination. Stonecutters rose early to avoid working in quarry heat later in the day. Water carriers traveled constantly between crews. Bakers prepared food before sunrise to feed hundreds of workers. Scribes recorded attendance and supplies during the cool morning hours. Every system depended on early waking. As the sun climbed higher overhead, the work became slower. Bodies tired. Breathing grew heavier. Conversations shortened. In some fields, farmers paused briefly beside irrigation canals to wash their faces with muddy river water. Others sat beneath small patches of shade created by date palms. Meals were simple. Bread, onions, dried fish, beer made from grain. Nothing luxurious. Only enough to continue working. The beer itself was often thick and cloudy, more nourishing than modern versions. It helped provide calories and hydration for workers spending entire days beneath the sun. Nearby, children chased one another between homes before eventually retreating indoors from the heat. Dogs stretched beneath carts. Goats searched lazily for scraps of food along dusty roads. The entire landscape now seemed quieter. Not silent, but slower. The midday heat drained movement from the world. In temple complexes, priests continued their rituals inside dim stone halls where thick walls protected against the worst of the sun. Incense drifted through sacred rooms. Statues rested beneath flickering lamplight. Outside, temple courtyards glowed white beneath intense brightness. Religion touched every part of Egyptian life. Morning prayers often accompanied waking routines. Some workers whispered small offerings to household gods before leaving home. Others visited shrines asking for health, strength, or protection from illness. Disease remained a constant presence. The heat spoiled food quickly. Water sources could become contaminated. Insects spread sickness along the riverbanks. Hard labor weakened the body over time. Many ordinary Egyptians likely lived with chronic pain or exhaustion that modern people would struggle to imagine. And still the mornings returned again and again. Before sunrise, workers rose from reed mats. Before sunrise, bread ovens glowed. Before sunrise, fishermen pushed boats into dark water. The rhythm never stopped. Near noon, market streets grew quieter beneath the heavy air. Merchants sat fanning themselves beside baskets of goods. Buyers moved slowly between stalls. Dust clung to sweaty skin. Somewhere nearby, a donkey stood motionless in a narrow strip of shade beside a wall. The smell of hot stone filled the city. Pottery workshops became almost unbearable during these hours. Kilns radiated intense heat into already suffocating rooms. Potters wiped sweat from their foreheads while shaping wet clay on spinning wheels. Finished jars lined the walls waiting to dry completely before firing. In carpentry workshops, sawdust floated through narrow shafts of sunlight. Woodworkers shaped stools, chests, doors, and boats using bronze tools worn smooth from years of use. Imported wood remained valuable in Egypt, where large trees were limited. Craftsmen treated good timber carefully. Their mornings began early too. Almost everyone's did. By afternoon, fatigue settled deeply into muscles and minds alike. Some workers rested briefly if possible. Others continued without pause because deadlines, harvests, or supervisors demanded it. Government projects especially operated on strict schedules tied closely to the Nile seasons. When floodwaters receded, planting had to begin quickly. When harvest season arrived, grain needed gathering before spoilage or loss. Time mattered greatly in ancient Egypt. And the coolest hours offered the best chance to use it wisely. Along quieter stretches of the river, fishermen repaired damaged boats while waiting for evening. Nets hung drying beside reeds. Small children played barefoot near the water's edge while mothers washed clothing nearby. The Nile remained beautiful even during exhausting days. Sunlight sparkled endlessly across moving water. Birds circled above marshes. Gentle wind occasionally softened the heat for a few precious moments. Palm trees cast shifting shadows along the banks. For many Egyptians, the river represented comfort as much as survival. At night, its sounds carried softly through open windows and rooftops where families slept beneath the stars. In the morning, its cool air greeted early workers before the heat arrived. During festivals, its waters carried decorated boats filled with music and offerings. Yet ordinary daily life beside the Nile was usually quiet. Simple. Repetitive. A cycle of waking, labor, food, fatigue, and rest. As afternoon slowly approached, some homes prepared for the evening meal even while the sun still blazed overhead. Women shaped fresh dough or stirred stews in clay pots. Water jars were checked carefully. Lamps waited nearby for darkness to return hours later. The long Egyptian day stretched onward. But already many workers quietly measured the sun's movement across the sky, hoping for cooler air after sunset. The exhaustion of heat settled heavily over shoulders and backs. Eyes narrowed against brightness. Sandals scraped slowly along dusty paths leading home from fields and workshops. And somewhere beyond the western desert cliffs, the distant promise of evening waited patiently for the tired people of the Nile. By the late afternoon, the sunlight over Egypt began to soften very slowly, though the heat still lingered heavily in the air. The stone walls of temples and homes continued releasing the warmth they had gathered throughout the day. Roads remained dusty beneath countless passing sandals. Along the Nile, the water reflected long bands of gold beneath the descending sun. For workers who had risen before dawn, this hour often felt very long. Their bodies carried the full weight of the day now. Farmers returned from the fields with tired shoulders and aching legs. Dust clung to their skin. Their linen garments hung damp with sweat. Some carried wooden tools across their backs while others guided exhausted animals slowly homeward through narrow paths between irrigation canals. The fields themselves looked calmer now. The harsh brightness of midday had faded into softer colors. Palm trees cast longer shadows across the earth. Water channels moved quietly beside rows of grain and vegetables. Birds settled near the marshes once again after hiding from the hottest hours. Many farmers paused briefly near the river before returning home. Some washed dust from their arms and faces. Others simply sat in silence for a few moments, listening to the sound of water moving through reeds. The Nile breeze felt cooler now, though still warm compared to the deep night ahead. These small moments of rest mattered deeply. Ancient Egyptian life left very little room for comfort. The body was almost always working or recovering from work. Morning labor blended into afternoon exhaustion, and evening became the only true chance to slow down before another early waking arrived. Along the docks, boats continued arriving from distant villages carrying grain, fish, stone, and pottery. Workers unloaded cargo more slowly now than they had in the morning. Their movements had become heavy and careful after long hours in the heat. Supervisors still watched closely. Scribes still counted goods. Merchants still argued quietly over prices. But the energy of the day had changed. The air itself seemed tired. In crowded towns, market sellers gathered unsold goods while sunlight faded from the streets. Clay jars were stacked carefully beside stalls. Bundles of reeds were tied together for transport. Fish sellers sprinkled water over the last remaining catches to keep them fresh a little longer. The smell of the evening city drifted through the warm air. Smoke from cooking fires. River mud cooling after the heat. Bread baking once more inside clay ovens. Sweat, dust, oil, and animals. The sounds of children slowly returned to the streets after hiding from the midday sun. Small groups played near homes while mothers called to them from doorways. Dogs wandered lazily between carts and baskets. Donkeys stood quietly beside walls, their sides rising slowly with tired breaths. Inside homes, evening routines had already begun. A woman crouched beside a small oven feeding pieces of dried reed into the fire. Nearby, dough baked slowly against the hot inner walls of the clay chamber. The smell of fresh bread filled the room. A pot of lentils simmered quietly while children sat nearby rubbing tired eyes. The inside of the house remained warm from the long day. Mud brick homes protected against some of the desert heat, but they could still feel heavy and crowded by evening, especially for large families sharing small spaces. Many people spent as much time outdoors as possible before sleeping. Some climbed onto flat rooftops after sunset where cooler air moved more freely. Others sat in courtyards beside oil lamps while darkness slowly spread across the village. The evening meal was often simple. Bread, beer, onions, beans, fish when available, dates or figs during certain seasons. Most ordinary Egyptians ate what they could afford and what the Nile provided. Meals were practical rather than luxurious. Food existed to sustain workers through long days of physical labor. Even children learned early not to waste it. After eating, some families repaired clothing or tools beneath fading light. Others spoke quietly about harvests, river levels, taxes, or illness spreading through nearby households. The concerns of daily survival never fully disappeared. An elderly woman sitting near a doorway slowly wove reeds into baskets while twilight deepened around her. Her fingers moved automatically from years of practice. Beside her, a young child had already fallen asleep against the wall, too tired to remain awake. In ancient Egypt, tiredness often arrived early. People woke before sunrise not only because of work but because the body itself demanded rest after enduring the heat. By nightfall, exhaustion spread through villages and cities alike. Builders returning from construction sites carried the dust of stone quarries across their skin and clothing. Some had spent the entire day hauling blocks beneath open skies. Others carved symbols into limestone walls while sunlight reflected painfully into their eyes. Their muscles ached deeply now. At workers' settlements near major building projects, men gathered outside simple housing made from mud, brick and stone. Water jars passed from hand to hand. Bread was shared quietly. A few spoke softly about injuries or difficult supervisors. Many simply sat in silence, too tired for conversation. Nearby, lamps flickered gently in the growing darkness. The desert beyond remained vast and still beneath the evening sky. As the sun finally disappeared behind western cliffs, temperatures slowly began to fall. The change did not happen quickly. Heat remained trapped inside roads, walls, and open ground for hours after sunset. But eventually cooler air drifted once again across the Nile Valley. These were peaceful hours. Not easy, but peaceful. The worst heat had passed. Priests inside temple complexes prepared evening rituals beneath tall stone columns darkened by shadow. Incense smoke curled upward through quiet halls while sacred chants echoed softly against carved walls. Temple workers lit additional lamps as darkness gathered in the courtyards. The stars slowly emerged above Egypt. Without modern lights, the night sky appeared enormous and bright. Constellations stretched clearly above the desert and river. The Milky Way shimmered across the darkness like pale dust scattered through the heavens. Ancient Egyptians watched these skies carefully. The stars helped mark seasons and time. Priests studied celestial movements connected to religious beliefs and agricultural cycles. Farmers observed the heavens while preparing for flood seasons. Boatmen used familiar stars while traveling along the Nile at night. For ordinary people, the stars also brought comfort. After long days of heat and labor, the cool night sky felt calm and endless above the sleeping world. Near the riverbanks, fishermen prepared once more for nighttime work. Some fishing happened after sunset when temperatures became more bearable and fish moved differently through the water. Lamps glowed softly on small boats drifting across the Nile. The river at night carried a different feeling than during the day. Quieter. Deeper. More mysterious. Water lapped gently against wooden hulls. Reeds whispered in the darkness. Frogs croaked along muddy banks. Somewhere in the distance, an oar dipped rhythmically into black water. Back in the villages, many families prepared sleeping spaces. Some spread woven mats across floors inside the home. Others climbed ladders to rooftops where cooler breezes moved through the night air. During hotter months, rooftop sleeping became common because indoor spaces trapped too much warmth. Children often fell asleep quickly after exhausting days. Adults remained awake a little longer. A father might sit silently staring toward the river after finishing his meal. A mother might rock a restless infant beneath the stars. Elderly relatives spoke quietly in corners while oil lamps burned low beside them. The sounds of Egypt slowly softened. Markets emptied. Animals settled. Workshops grew silent one by one. Only distant voices and the occasional barking dog disturbed the quiet. And still, even during these peaceful nighttime hours, many people already understood how early the next morning would come. The cycle never paused. Before sunrise, ovens would glow again. Before sunrise, fishermen would untangle nets. Before sunrise, farmers would return to the fields. This rhythm shaped entire lives. For wealthy Egyptians, nighttime sometimes offered more comfort. Large homes with inner courtyards allowed better airflow. Servants prepared sleeping areas carefully. Linen sheets rested on raised wooden beds instead of woven mats on packed earth floors. Yet even wealthy households often followed the same general schedule as everyone else. The climate itself encouraged early waking and early sleep. There was little reason to remain awake deep into the night except during festivals, ceremonies, or special occasions. Most people simply followed the movement of light and temperature. Darkness encouraged rest. Sunrise demanded labor. In one small village farther south, an old farmer climbed slowly onto his rooftop carrying a woven mat beneath one arm. The air finally felt cooler against his skin. He lowered himself carefully beside his sleeping grandchildren and stared upward into the vast sky above the Nile Valley. His hands were rough from decades of labor. His knees hurt constantly now. The skin across his shoulders had been burned by the Egyptian sun for most of his life. And tomorrow, before sunrise, he would wake again. Not because he wished to, but because survival depended upon it. This was true for millions of ordinary Egyptians across centuries of history. Their lives moved according to heat, light, labor, and the river. The grand temples and monuments that survived into modern times were built by people whose daily existence revolved around exhaustion and routine. The world remembered the kings. But ancient Egypt truly belonged to workers rising quietly in darkness long before dawn. As deeper night settled across the land, the Nile reflected silver moonlight beneath drifting reeds. Palm trees swayed gently in the cooler wind. Oil lamps burned lower inside mud brick homes. One by one, voices faded into silence. Far away in the desert, warm winds moved softly across empty sand beneath the stars. And across Egypt, tired bodies rested carefully through the quiet hours, waiting for another early morning beside the eternal river. During the deepest hours of the night, Egypt became very quiet. The heat that had covered the land all day slowly drifted upward into the dark sky. Stone walls cooled little by little. Dust settled over empty roads. The Nile moved silently beneath the stars, carrying black water through sleeping towns and villages. For a short time, the world felt still. Most workers slept heavily from exhaustion. Their bodies needed every possible hour of rest before morning returned again. Inside mud brick homes, families lay close together on woven mats or simple wooden beds. Thin linen cloth covered tired bodies while warm night air moved softly through open windows and rooftop spaces. Children slept first and deepest. Adults often woke during the night. A mother might rise quietly to comfort a restless baby. An old man with aching joints might shift carefully on his mat while listening to the distant sounds of dogs barking near the riverbank. Somewhere, someone coughed in the darkness. Somewhere else, sandals scraped softly against stone as a late traveler moved through narrow streets. Ancient Egyptian nights were never fully silent. The Nile itself always made sound. Water touched reeds along the shore. Boats creaked gently against wooden docks. Frogs called from muddy banks. Insects hummed in the darkness beside canals and marshes. For those sleeping near the river, these sounds became part of life itself. They were as familiar as breathing. Children grew up hearing the Nile at night long before they understood its importance to their survival. The river gave food, water, trade, and transportation. But it also shaped sleep. Cooler air often drifted inland from the Nile after sunset, making nighttime rest slightly easier during hot seasons. Families sometimes arranged sleeping spaces carefully to catch these faint breezes. Rooftops became crowded during summer nights because the open air felt gentler than the trapped heat inside homes. Above them, the stars stretched endlessly across the sky. Without artificial lights, the heavens appeared bright and sharp over the desert. Ancient Egyptians recognized patterns in these stars and connected them deeply to religion, agriculture, and timekeeping. Priests observed celestial movements from temple rooftops. Farmers watched for seasonal signs linked to the Nile floods. Even ordinary workers became familiar with the night sky through years of early waking. Many began their days while stars still remained visible above the eastern horizon. And some mornings began even earlier than usual. Bakers, for example, often woke in the deepest darkness long before most households stirred awake. Bread required time and labor. Grain needed grinding. Dough needed preparing. Ovens needed heating carefully with reeds, wood, or dried animal fuel. Inside bakery spaces, fires glowed against clay walls while the rest of Egypt still slept. The air grew thick with smoke and heat almost immediately. Women knelt beside grinding stones, pushing heavy upper stones back and forth over grain. The work strained shoulders, arms, and lower backs. Fine dust floated through the warm darkness, settling into hair, skin, and lungs. This labor repeated every single day. Bread fed nearly everyone. So bakers rose before sunrise. Nearby, beer makers also began their work early. Ancient Egyptian beer was made from grain and served as an important source of nutrition for many ordinary people. Workers drank it during meals and breaks throughout the day. Preparing large amounts required careful timing and constant attention. The smell of fermenting grain drifted through workshops while lamps flickered nearby. Outside these early workplaces, the villages still remained mostly dark. A few guards moved through larger towns carrying lamps or torches. Temple servants prepared for dawn rituals. Fishermen sleeping beside the river occasionally stirred awake to check their boats or watch changing weather along the water. Then slowly, almost invisibly, the eastern sky began to change. Not yet sunrise. Only the faintest softening of darkness. This moment came quietly over the Nile Valley each morning. The stars nearest the horizon faded first. The desert cliffs became faint outlines against the sky. Palm trees emerged slowly from shadow. Cool air still lingered for a little while longer. And across Egypt, people began waking again. A farmer opened tired eyes inside a small home crowded with sleeping relatives. For a moment he remained still, listening to the sounds outside. Somewhere nearby, another family was already awake. He could hear grinding stones moving rhythmically through the darkness. His muscles already hurt from yesterday's labor. Still, he sat up carefully. There was work waiting. Always work waiting. He stepped onto the cool packed earth floor and reached for simple linen clothing folded nearby. The room smelled faintly of smoke and dust. A clay jar of water rested beside the wall. In another corner, grain baskets stood covered against insects and rats. Outside, the village slowly came alive once more. Women carried water jars balanced carefully against their shoulders. Men prepared tools beside narrow roads. Donkeys shifted impatiently as loads were tied into place. Somewhere, a rooster called into the fading darkness. Morning in ancient Egypt did not arrive suddenly. It unfolded slowly. The Nile reflected pale silver beneath the brightening sky while fishing boats slipped quietly onto the water. Oars moved rhythmically through calm currents. Nets rested in woven piles at the bottom of the boats. The fishermen spoke little at this hour. Their hands already knew the routine. Some had followed it since childhood. Others inherited boats and nets from fathers and grandfathers who had worked the same waters before them. The Nile connected generations through repeated labor. Fishing spots, canal routes, and flood patterns passed through families like treasured knowledge. And still the mornings remained early because fish spoiled quickly once the day became hot. Timing mattered. Everything depended on timing. Along irrigation canals, farmers checked water flow before sunrise fully arrived. Egypt's farming system required careful management of canals, dikes, and reservoirs connected to the Nile floods. Water had to move properly across fields to keep crops alive. This demanded constant labor. Mud walls broke easily. Canals clogged with reeds or silt. Floodwaters changed the landscape every year. Teams of workers often repaired irrigation systems during cooler morning hours before the heat became dangerous. Nearby, children rubbed sleep from their eyes while carrying baskets or helping with animals. Childhood in ancient Egypt rarely remained carefree for long. Most children slowly entered adult responsibilities through daily work beside their families. A young girl might begin learning bread making before sunrise. A boy might help drive goats toward grazing areas while stars still lingered overhead. These routines shaped life from the earliest years. Near larger cities, temple complexes also awakened before dawn. Priests purified themselves using water from sacred basins. White linen garments rustled softly through dark hallways lit by oil lamps. Incense smoke drifted upward beneath enormous stone ceilings carved with scenes of gods and kings. Morning rituals held deep meaning. The return of sunlight symbolized renewal, order, and survival. As the sun god Ra emerged once more from darkness, Egypt itself awakened beside him. Temple doors opened slowly. Prayers echoed through quiet chambers. Offerings of bread, beer, fruit, flowers, and incense were prepared carefully before daylight fully reached the courtyards. Even outside the temples, ordinary people understood the spiritual importance of sunrise. Some whispered small prayers before beginning labor. Others touched protective amulets hanging around their necks or resting inside their homes. Life felt uncertain for many Egyptians. Illness could spread quickly. Floods could fail. Harvests could suffer. Injuries from labor could end a family's stability. So daily rituals brought comfort and structure to uncertain lives. As dawn brightened further, the first sunlight finally touched the tops of distant cliffs beyond the Nile. Gold spread slowly across temple towers, palm leaves, and river water. Birds rose from the marshes. The coolness of night began fading once again. Workers moved faster now. Morning had fully arrived. Inside workshops, craftsmen prepared tools before temperatures rose too high. Potters mixed wet clay beside spinning wheels. Stone carvers sharpened bronze instruments against rough surfaces. Weavers arranged linen threads carefully inside dim workrooms. The sound of labor returned everywhere. Hammering. Grinding. Splashing water. Animal calls. Voices drifting through dusty streets. Egypt breathed itself awake once more. Near one crowded market street, an elderly woman arranged vegetables beside woven baskets while her grandson swept dust from the ground nearby. The market would soon grow noisy and crowded, but early morning still felt peaceful for a little while longer. She preferred this hour. The cooler air. The quieter streets. The gentle sunlight before noon brightness arrived. Many Egyptians likely felt the same. Morning carried possibility before exhaustion settled into the body again. During these early hours, workers still possessed strength. Shadows remained long. The air felt lighter. Even difficult labor seemed more manageable before the full heat descended upon the land. This was why waking before sunrise became such an essential part of Egyptian life. Not merely custom. Not only discipline. But adaptation. The climate itself demanded it. And generation after generation learned to shape their lives around the narrow window of cooler morning hours beside the eternal Nile. As the sun climbed higher once again above fields, temples, workshops, and riverboats, another long day quietly unfolded across ancient Egypt. As the morning continued across the Nile Valley, sunlight spread into every corner of daily life. The cool gray colors of dawn disappeared beneath warmer shades of gold and pale white. Palm leaves shimmered gently in the growing brightness. Thin smoke curled upward from cooking fires. The river reflected the widening sky like polished metal moving slowly through the land. By now, Egypt was fully awake. The roads between villages filled with movement. Farmers walked toward distant fields carrying hoes and wooden tools over their shoulders. Merchants guided donkeys loaded with baskets and pottery. Servants hurried through city streets balancing water jars carefully against their hips. Everywhere, sandals brushed against dust. The smell of fresh bread still lingered in the air from the early baking hours. Along narrow streets, women sat near open doorways grinding grain while speaking quietly with neighbors beside them. Children carried bundles of reeds or followed older relatives toward workshops and fields. Morning labor blended naturally into the rhythm of ordinary life. Nothing felt separate from work. The home itself was a place of labor. The river was labor. The fields were labor. Even preparing rest for the night required labor beforehand. In one small riverside village, a fisherman pulled his boat slowly onto muddy ground after returning from the Nile. Fish glistened faintly inside woven baskets at his feet. His hands smelled of river water and wet rope. Nearby, his young son carefully spread damaged nets across the ground to dry in the sunlight before repair. The fisherman squinted toward the brightening sky. Already the day felt warmer than it had only an hour earlier. He understood this change deeply because he had lived beside it his entire life. The Nile mornings offered a brief kindness before the desert heat stretched over the valley once again. Every experienced worker learned to notice the small signs. The changing color of sunlight. The feel of dust beneath sandals. The stillness of the air before heat waves rose from the earth. Ancient Egyptian life required close attention to nature because survival depended upon it. In the fields, farmers now moved steadily through irrigation channels carrying buckets of river water suspended from wooden poles across their shoulders. Water splashed against their legs as they walked. Mud pressed between their toes. Their bodies bent repeatedly beneath the weight of the work. Nearby, oxen pulled simple plows through dark fertile soil left behind by the Nile floods. Birds followed closely behind searching for insects disturbed by the turning earth. The sounds of farming were slow and repetitive. Wood creaking. Animals breathing heavily. Water pouring into canals. Workers calling softly to one another across the fields. Nothing rushed. The labor was too endless for rushing. A farmer might spend his entire life waking before sunrise to perform many of the same tasks day after day. Yet within these routines existed deep knowledge passed carefully between generations. Fathers taught sons when to plant according to flood levels. Mothers taught daughters how to store grain safely through hot seasons. Grandparents explained weather signs carried in the wind or river currents. This quiet wisdom shaped Egypt as much as kings or temples. Farther north, inside a crowded pottery workshop, the morning heat already gathered heavily against the walls. Clay jars lined wooden shelves waiting to dry completely before firing. Potters sat hunched over spinning wheels, shaping wet clay carefully with practiced fingers. The room smelled of earth and smoke. Sweat darkened linen clothing. Outside, sunlight flashed brightly across dusty streets, while inside the workshop only narrow beams of light reached through small openings near the ceiling. One young apprentice carried water from a nearby canal to keep the clay moist. His arms trembled slightly beneath the weight of the jar. He had likely risen before dawn like everyone else in the workshop. Perhaps he had slept only a few hours. Perhaps his back already ached despite his youth. Ancient Egyptian work began early and often continued until the body could barely continue. Even skilled craftsmen rarely escaped exhaustion entirely. Near the center of a larger city, scribes gathered inside shaded administrative rooms while servants opened shutters to allow morning air inside. Papyrus scrolls rested neatly beside ink palettes and sharpened reed pens. The scribes lowered themselves carefully onto mats or stools and began their long hours of writing. Some recorded grain taxes arriving from farming villages. Others tracked shipments moving along the Nile. Some copied religious texts or official decrees. Their work demanded patience and concentration rather than physical strength, yet it could still feel exhausting in the Egyptian climate. The air inside these rooms grew warmer quickly as the morning advanced. Sweat gathered beneath collars and sleeves. Ink dried faster on hot days. Fingers cramped from constant writing. Still, many Egyptians viewed the life of a scribe as desirable compared to heavy labor in fields or quarries. A scribe's hands remained softer. His back carried fewer scars. He worked in shade rather than beneath direct sunlight. Yet even scribes woke before sunrise because the entire society moved according to the same natural rhythm of light and heat. Outside the city walls, desert winds began stirring loose sand across open ground. The cliffs beyond the Nile Valley glowed pale beneath the strengthening sun. Travelers moving between settlements wrapped cloth around their heads and faces against dust carried through the air. Journeys were often planned carefully around temperature. Travelers preferred to begin before sunrise whenever possible. Walking long distances beneath midday heat could become dangerous very quickly. Water needed protection from evaporation. Animals tired easily beneath the blazing sky. Caravans crossing desert regions sometimes moved mostly during cooler hours while resting during the worst afternoon heat. The land itself demanded respect. In wealthier homes near temple districts, servants now completed morning cleaning routines before the heat became overwhelming. Reed brushes swept dust from stone floors. Water was poured carefully over courtyards to cool the ground slightly. Fresh linen clothing was folded neatly beside sleeping areas. Large homes often contained inner courtyards with pools, trees, or shaded walkways designed to soften the climate. Even so, comfort remained limited during the hottest seasons. No one fully escaped the Egyptian sun. Inside one quiet courtyard, a nobleman sat eating a simple morning meal of bread, figs, and beer while listening to distant city sounds beyond the walls. Servants moved silently nearby. A fountain trickled softly into a shallow basin. Yet beyond these shaded spaces, thousands of ordinary workers already strained beneath rising temperatures. Stone carriers, brick makers, boatmen, farmers, fishermen. Labor supported the entire structure of Egyptian society. And nearly all of it began before dawn. At a limestone quarry farther south, workers chipped blocks from pale rock faces using bronze and stone tools. Dust coated their skin and filled the air around them. Supervisors watched from nearby while teams coordinated the movement of heavy stone onto wooden sledges. The sun reflected harshly from the white stone surfaces. Even during morning hours, the heat could feel blinding here. Water carriers moved constantly between crews distributing precious jars of river water. Without these early hours of cooler air, the labor might have become impossible. Many workers wrapped cloth around their heads for protection against sunlight and dust. Their bodies glistened with sweat long before midday. Some sang quietly while working. Not joyful songs. Steady songs. Rhythms to help coordinate movement and pass the long hours. The pyramids, temples, statues, and tombs of Egypt rose from this kind of labor. Beneath every monument stood generations of tired workers waking in darkness beside the Nile. As the sun climbed higher, shadows shortened across roads and fields. Birds retreated toward reeds and palm groves seeking cooler shelter. Market activity increased steadily while merchants called softly to passing customers. The markets themselves became crowded mixtures of sound, movement, and smell. Fish laid on woven mats. Vegetables stacked beside baskets. Goats wandering between stalls. Dust drifting through warm air. Women negotiated prices while children carried bundles through narrow pathways between sellers. Despite the activity, there remained a strange slowness to the atmosphere. Heat discouraged sudden movement. People conserved energy carefully because the day was still long ahead. In one corner of the market, a bread seller arranged warm loaves beside clay jars of beer while wiping sweat from his forehead. Nearby, an old woman sold onions and garlic from shallow baskets resting directly on the ground. The smell of baked grain mixed with dust and animal scents beneath the growing heat. Above the city, the sky remained bright and empty. Clouds rarely softened the Egyptian sun. Near midday, many workers began showing signs of exhaustion already. Movements slowed. Conversations became shorter. Faces tightened against brightness. Yet the work continued. Canals still needed clearing. Boats still needed unloading. Stone still needed moving. Ancient Egypt survived through endless repetition of labor shaped around the rising and setting sun. And as the heat settled more heavily over the Nile Valley once again, many quietly remembered the softness of the morning hours that had already passed, and looked ahead toward the distant relief of evening beside the river. By midday, the heat lay across Egypt like a heavy blanket. The brightness above the Nile Valley became almost painful to the eyes. Sunlight reflected from stone walls, river water, and pale roads until the entire landscape shimmered beneath the sky. Dust hung motionless in the warm air. Even the wind seemed tired. For those who had been awake since before sunrise, this was often the hardest part of the day. The body slowed naturally beneath the heat. Breathing felt heavier. Clothing clung damply to skin. Workers searched constantly for small pieces of shade wherever they could find them. In the farming fields, men rested briefly beside irrigation canals while oxen stood with lowered heads near the water. Some workers removed simple sandals and dipped aching feet into the muddy edges of the Nile channels. Others sat silently beneath date palms eating bread softened with water or beer. No one wasted energy speaking too much during these hours. The sun drained conversation from people. A farmer wiped sweat slowly from his brow with the edge of his linen garment while staring across the bright fields before him. The grain moved gently in the faint breeze. Farther away, another group of workers continued repairing a damaged canal wall using wet mud and woven reeds. The labor never completely stopped. But it changed pace. Morning had been for strength. Midday became a test of endurance. Children helping in the fields grew quiet now. Their earlier energy disappeared beneath the heat. Some rested beside baskets while parents continued working nearby. Babies slept in shaded corners beneath cloth coverings stretched carefully between poles. Along the riverbanks, fishermen cleaned their morning catches beneath woven shelters made from reeds and palm branches. Flies drifted around baskets filled with fish laid over damp cloth. The smell of river water mixed with scales, mud, and hot wood from nearby docks. The fishermen moved slowly. Their hands were rough from years of rope and water. Their shoulders carried the memory of countless early mornings spent rowing across the Nile before sunrise. Nearby, boats rocked gently against wooden posts while the afternoon light flashed brightly across the water. The Nile itself appeared almost sleepy beneath the heat. The current moved steadily, but the riverbanks had grown quieter now. Fewer travelers walked the roads during midday if they could avoid it. Many merchants paused their journeys until later hours when the air became easier to breathe. Inside crowded towns, narrow streets trapped heat between mud brick walls. The smell of dust, animals, sweat, and cooking fires thickened beneath the sun. Shopkeepers sat fanning themselves beside baskets of goods while waiting patiently for customers. Some market stalls closed temporarily during the hottest hours. Others remained open because survival demanded every possible sale. A pottery seller sat beneath a cloth canopy watching sunlight creep slowly across the street before him. Rows of clay jars stood neatly arranged beside woven baskets and small oil lamps. The seller's eyes looked tired from the brightness. He had likely been awake since long before dawn. Most people had. In one nearby alley, a woman carried water jars from a public well toward her home while carefully balancing the weight against her shoulders. The path beneath her sandals felt hot now. Sweat rolled down her neck beneath dark hair tied back against the heat. Water became precious during midday. Families stored it carefully inside clay jars designed to keep it cooler for longer periods. Even so, the water often tasted warm by afternoon. Still, it brought relief. Inside ordinary homes, some people rested briefly during the hottest hours if work allowed it. Mud brick walls helped block a portion of the sunlight, creating dim interiors where tired bodies escaped the brightness outside. A grandmother rested against the wall while weaving reeds into baskets with slow, patient movements. Nearby, two children slept quietly on woven mats while flies buzzed lazily near the doorway. The room smelled of dust, bread, smoke, and warm clay. Outside, the village remained strangely calm beneath the blazing sky. Dogs slept in narrow strips of shade. Donkeys stood nearly motionless beside carts. Even birds moved less frequently now. The entire land seemed to pause beneath the weight of the afternoon heat. But not everyone could rest. At large construction sites, workers continued hauling stone despite exhaustion. Supervisors tracked progress carefully because royal building projects followed strict schedules. Teams of laborers strained against ropes while dragging limestone blocks across packed earth roads. The work was brutally difficult. Sandals scraped against stone. Muscles trembled beneath the strain. Dust coated faces and arms until workers appeared almost white beneath layers of pale powder. Water carriers moved constantly through the site distributing jars to exhausted crews. Some workers wrapped wet cloth around their heads for relief against the sun. Yet many still suffered from dehydration, dizziness, and heat sickness. Ancient Egyptian labor demanded enormous physical sacrifice from ordinary people. And still they woke before sunrise because those early hours offered the only chance to complete the hardest tasks before the full strength of midday arrived. Inside temple complexes, thick stone walls protected priests and servants from some of the heat outside. The air within long hallways felt cooler and darker than the streets beyond. Incense drifted softly through sacred chambers where lamps flickered before statues of the gods. Temple workers moved quietly through shadowed corridors carrying offerings of bread, flowers, beer, and fruit. Even here, however, the heat remained present. Stone floors slowly absorbed warmth from the outside world. Sweat gathered beneath linen robes during ceremonies and prayers. But temples still offered one of the few places where silence and coolness could exist together during the hottest part of the day. Farther north along the Nile, scribes continued working inside administrative buildings where sunlight entered only through narrow windows high in the walls. Papyrus scrolls covered low tables and floors beside ink palettes made from wood or stone. One scribe paused to flex cramped fingers before continuing his careful writing. Outside, workers shouted near the docks while cargo boats unloaded grain beneath the sun. Inside, only the scratching sound of reed pens disturbed the quiet room. The scribe's work required patience rather than physical strength, yet long hours of concentration in the heavy heat brought their own exhaustion. His eyes burned from reading small symbols. His back ached from sitting cross-legged on hard floors. And tomorrow, before sunrise, he would wake again beside the Nile like everyone else. The rhythm of Egyptian life left little room for escape. Morning labor. Afternoon endurance. Evening recovery. Nighttime rest. Then the cycle returned once more. In wealthier homes, servants poured water across stone courtyards to cool the surfaces slightly. Curtains soaked in water hung across open windows in hopes of catching cooler breezes. Noble families rested indoors beneath shaded ceilings while musicians played softly in distant rooms. Yet even the wealthy remained tied to the movement of the sun. The climate shaped every life. Far outside the fertile Nile Valley, the desert shimmered endlessly beneath the afternoon sky. Sand dunes and rocky cliffs radiated trapped heat into the air. Travelers crossing these regions carefully avoided unnecessary movement during midday whenever possible. Caravans often rested in shaded areas beside wells until temperatures softened later in the day. Camels had not yet become common in early ancient Egypt, so many journeys relied on donkeys carrying goods across difficult terrain. These animals also suffered beneath the heat, their sides rising heavily as they waited motionless beside supply bundles. Near one desert road, a trader sat beneath a rough cloth shelter sharing bread and dates with two companions while waiting for evening travel. Their water jars rested carefully in the shade beside them. No one hurried beneath the Egyptian sun. The land punished haste. Back along the Nile, afternoon slowly stretched onward. The brightness remained intense, but subtle changes began appearing at the edges of the day. Shadows lengthened slightly beside walls and trees. Breezes from the river returned in faint gentle movements. Workers noticed these signs immediately. The worst heat would not last forever. A fisherman repairing nets near the riverbank looked westward toward the distant desert cliffs where the sun would eventually descend. His hands moved automatically through tangled fibers while nearby children played quietly in the mud beside the water. The Nile breeze touched his face for a moment. Cooler than before. Small reliefs mattered deeply in ancient Egypt. A patch of shade. A sip of water. A breeze from the river. The body learned to treasure these things after long days beneath relentless sunlight. As afternoon continued drifting slowly toward evening, the sounds of Egypt began changing once again. Workers spoke more frequently. Market sellers rearranged goods for returning customers. Boatmen prepared ropes and sails for later journeys along cooler waters. The land itself seemed to breathe more easily. And throughout villages, cities, workshops, temples, and fields, tired people quietly carried themselves forward through another ancient day beside the eternal Nile, already knowing that tomorrow morning would begin again in darkness before the first pale light of sunrise touched the river. As the afternoon slowly softened, Egypt seemed to awaken for a second time. The fierce brightness that had covered the land for hours began losing its sharp edge. Sunlight turned warmer now, glowing softly against temple walls and mud brick homes. Long shadows stretched across roads where dust still drifted lazily beneath tired footsteps. The change came gradually. A faint breeze moved across the Nile. Palm leaves rustled gently. Birds returned to the riverbanks after hiding through the hottest part of the day. For workers bent beneath hours of labor, these small changes brought quiet relief. In the fields, farmers straightened aching backs and looked toward the western sky. The hardest heat had passed. Their bodies still felt exhausted, but movement became easier now. Oxen resumed pulling wooden plows through dark soil while water continued flowing through irrigation canals beside rows of grain. The smell of wet earth rose softly from the fields. Nearby, children helped gather tools left scattered beside the canals. Their faces and arms carried streaks of dust and dried mud from the long day. One young boy stumbled sleepily while carrying a basket nearly too heavy for him. His father took the load without speaking and continued walking slowly toward the village path. Words were often unnecessary after such long days. Families understood one another through routine. They had lived beside the same river, beneath the same sun, through the same exhausting cycles for generations. Near the Nile docks, activity increased again as evening approached. Boats prepared for departures timed carefully with changing winds and cooler nighttime travel. Sailcloth fluttered gently above wooden decks while workers secured bundles of grain, pottery, and woven cloth. The river reflected deep gold beneath the lowering sun. Fishermen sat repairing hooks and nets beside the shore while waiting for darkness. Some would spend much of the night on the water because evening fishing felt easier on the body than working beneath midday heat. A young fisherman crouched near the river's edge washing mud from his hands while listening to water brush softly against reeds nearby. Behind him, his older brother untangled a damaged net stretched across wooden stakes. Both men looked tired beyond their years. The Nile gave life, but it demanded labor in return. Farther inland, crowded market streets slowly filled again after the quieter midday hours. Merchants called gently to passing customers while arranging vegetables, fish, bread, sandals, and pottery beneath cloth coverings. Donkeys pushed through narrow pathways carrying heavy loads between stalls. The smells of the market grew stronger in the evening warmth. Fresh bread, sweat, river fish, smoke from cooking fires beginning to rise above the city. Women carrying baskets stopped briefly to bargain for onions or lentils before returning home to prepare the evening meal. Children wandered beside them rubbing tired eyes while dust clung to their feet and ankles. The market no longer felt harsh like midday. Now it carried a softer energy. Still busy. Still crowded. But calmer somehow beneath the fading light. Inside workshops, craftsmen hurried quietly to complete final tasks before darkness arrived. Potters stacked drying jars carefully against walls. Carpenters gathered tools worn smooth from constant use. Weavers folded linen cloth while the last sunlight slipped through narrow windows. Many workshops lacked strong lighting after sunset. Oil lamps existed, but they provided only limited brightness and required valuable fuel. So much skilled labor naturally followed the movement of daylight. Morning and evening became the most productive hours. A stone carver working near a temple entrance brushed pale dust from his arms before lowering his tools beside the wall. Tiny fragments of limestone covered the ground around him. His shoulders ached deeply after hours spent striking stone beneath the sun. He sat quietly for a moment. The evening breeze touched his face. Somewhere nearby, temple bells sounded softly through the city. Inside the great temples, Priests prepared evening rituals as sunlight dimmed across towering columns carved with sacred symbols. Long shadows filled the courtyards. Incense drifted slowly through the cooling air while servants lit additional lamps beside statues of the gods. The temples changed beautifully at this hour. During midday they stood bright and overwhelming beneath the sun. But evening softened everything. Stone walls glowed amber and red. Columns disappeared gradually into shadow. Voices echoed more gently through the halls. For ordinary Egyptians passing nearby after long days of labor, the sight of these glowing temples may have brought comfort. The rituals continued every day without fail. Morning prayers greeted sunrise. Evening ceremonies welcomed night. The gods remained steady while human lives passed beneath them. Near one temple wall, an old woman sat selling small woven charms and simple offerings to worshippers entering the complex. Her hands trembled slightly with age as she arranged tiny reed baskets beneath fading light. She had probably spent decades waking before sunrise. Most people did. Ancient Egyptian life trained the body into early rhythms from childhood onward. Even on days without urgent work, many people naturally woke before dawn because their entire lives had been shaped around cooler morning hours. The body remembered. Long before the mind fully woke, labor waited patiently in the darkness. In poorer neighborhoods near the edges of larger cities, families now gathered outside their homes to escape indoor heat trapped inside mud brick walls. Children sat beside grandparents listening quietly while women prepared food nearby. A pot of lentils simmered slowly over a small fire. Flat bread rested beneath cloth coverings. The smell of smoke drifted upward into the evening sky. One man rinsed dust from his feet using water poured carefully from a clay jar. Another repaired cracked leather sandals beneath the fading sunlight. Across the narrow street, neighbors spoke softly about river levels and harvest conditions while tired dogs stretched beside them. These moments of evening rest were deeply important. The workday slowly loosened its grip on the body. Shoulders relaxed. Voices softened. The air cooled little by little. Along rooftop sleeping spaces, woven mats were already being prepared for later in the night. During hot months, many families preferred sleeping beneath the open sky rather than inside crowded rooms where heat remained trapped until morning. From these rooftops, Egypt looked peaceful at dusk. Smoke rose from hundreds of cooking fires. Palm trees moved gently in the breeze. The Nile reflected the final light of day like flowing bronze. And beyond everything, the desert stretched silent and endless beneath the darkening sky. Travelers approaching villages at this hour often felt enormous relief. Walking beneath the midday sun exhausted both humans and animals alike. Evening allowed movement to become bearable once more. A small group of traders entered one riverside settlement leading donkeys loaded with baskets and rolled cloth. Dust covered their legs nearly to the knees. Their faces appeared dry and worn from travel. Children watched them pass with sleepy curiosity while adults barely glanced up from evening chores. Travelers were common along Nile routes. Boats and roads connected countless settlements through trade and labor. Life moved constantly beside the river. But never quickly. Ancient Egypt carried a slow rhythm shaped by heat, water, and sunlight. As dusk deepened further, lamps began appearing one by one inside homes and workshops. Their small flames flickered softly through doorways and windows. Shadows danced across walls blackened slightly by years of smoke. The stars emerged gradually overhead. First the brightest. Then countless others. The sky above Egypt became vast once more. A farmer returning late from distant fields paused briefly beside the river before continuing home. His feet hurt. His hands were cracked from labor. Dust coated the edges of his linen clothing. but the air felt cooler now. For a few moments he simply listened. Water moving against reeds. A bird calling somewhere across the marsh. Voices drifting faintly from nearby homes. These quiet evening sounds followed generations of Egyptians through their lives. Workers heard them after long days in fields and workshops. Children fell asleep to them. Elderly people listened while resting aching bodies beneath the stars. The Nile was never completely silent. And neither was Egypt. Even at night, bakers prepared for tomorrow. Fishermen repaired nets for the next morning. Temple servants cleaned sacred spaces before dawn rituals. The cycle continued endlessly beneath the stars. Soon many families would sleep. And before the eastern sky brightened again, countless ordinary people across the Nile Valley would rise quietly from woven mats and rooftop beds, beginning another day before sunrise in the ancient world. Part 8. Night settled fully across Egypt with a softness that felt almost sacred after the long heat of the day. The western horizon faded from gold into deep blue, and then slowly into darkness. One by one, the final colors disappeared from the cliffs beyond the Nile. The river darkened beneath the stars, moving quietly through the sleeping land like a slow black ribbon. Cooler air drifted gently through villages and cities now. Not cold. Never truly cold beside the Nile for most of the year. But cooler enough for tired bodies to breathe more easily again. Across rooftops, courtyards, and open sleeping spaces, families settled down for the night. Woven mats were spread carefully across flat roofs where faint breezes moved more freely than inside crowded homes. Thin linen cloth rustled softly in the darkness. Children already slept deeply. Adults remained awake a little longer. A mother sat beside a small oil lamp mending torn clothing while her youngest child slept nearby. The tiny flame cast golden light across her hands and face. Beyond the rooftop wall, distant voices drifted softly through the night air. Someone laughed far away. A donkey brayed once near the road. Then silence returned again. The city moved differently at night. Its daytime noise had faded into scattered sounds carried gently through darkness. Without the crushing heat of midday, people spoke more slowly. Even footsteps seemed softer. Near the riverbanks, fishermen prepared for nighttime work beneath the stars. Small lamps glowed inside wooden boats while nets rested in careful piles beside baskets and coiled rope. The fishermen pushed away from shore quietly, allowing the Nile current to carry them into deeper water. At night, the river felt larger. The darkness erased many familiar landmarks along the shore. Reeds became shadows. Distant boats appeared only as tiny moving lights reflected faintly across the water. The fishermen knew these waters well enough to move through darkness almost by instinct. Their fathers had taught them. And their fathers before them. Ancient Egyptian life depended deeply on memory passed through generations. Most workers learned not from books or formal teaching, but from repetition beside older family members. A fisherman learned currents and seasons. A farmer learned flood patterns and planting cycles. A baker learned the feel of dough beneath tired hands before sunrise. Everything was taught slowly through routine. And nearly every routine began in darkness before dawn. In one village farther south, an elderly farmer lay awake on a rooftop staring upward into the enormous night sky. His grandchildren slept nearby beneath thin cloth coverings. Warm wind brushed softly across the roof. The old man's body hurt constantly now. Years of labor had bent his back and hardened his hands. His knees stiffened painfully each morning before sunrise. Sometimes his fingers trembled while gripping tools. Still, he continued waking early every day. Not because his body welcomed it, but because life beside the Nile demanded it. The stars above him appeared endless tonight. Ancient Egyptians looked at these same constellations for thousands of years. Priests connected them to the gods. Travelers followed them across desert roads. Workers watched them fade slowly before dawn each morning. For many people, the stars marked the final peaceful moments before another exhausting day began. Inside temples, priests moved quietly through dark corridors carrying oil lamps that flickered against towering stone walls. Evening rituals had ended, but temple life never fully stopped. Sacred fires required attention. Offerings needed preparation for morning ceremonies. The temple smelled of incense, stone dust, oil, and cool shadows. Far outside the walls, ordinary workers slept closely together in small homes where the air still carried traces of the day's heat. Mud brick walls released warmth slowly into the night. Families shifted restlessly on woven mats while insects buzzed near windows and doorways. Sleep in ancient Egypt was not always deep or comfortable. Mosquitoes gathered near water. Animals made noise nearby. Babies cried. Neighbors spoke late into the evening. And many workers carried physical pain into bed each night after long days beneath the sun. Yet exhaustion usually overcame discomfort eventually. A stone laborer near a quarry settlement fell asleep almost immediately after eating his evening meal beside co-workers. Dust still covered his arms and face. He had intended to repair part of his sandal before sleeping, but fatigue closed his eyes before he could begin. Tomorrow, long before sunrise, supervisors would wake the workers again. Stone needed moving. Tools needed sharpening. Construction never paused for long. Along the Nile docks, a few late boats still traveled beneath the moonlight. Their sails drifted pale against the dark water while rowers moved slowly through silver reflections. Cargo wrapped carefully beneath cloth coverings rested inside the boats beside jars and baskets. Night travel could feel peaceful compared to the burning afternoons. The air cooled. The river calmed. And the stars guided movement across the water. Some boatmen preferred these quiet journeys despite the dangers of darkness. Crocodiles lurked in parts of the Nile. Sandbanks shifted unexpectedly. Strong currents could surprise tired rowers. Still, nighttime offered relief from the relentless heat. And relief mattered deeply in ancient Egypt. Inside ordinary homes, morning preparations had already begun even before midnight fully passed. Grain waited beside grinding stones. Water jars were checked carefully. Bread ovens rested cold for now, but not for long. Many women who managed households carried endless responsibilities that stretched from darkness into darkness again. Before sunrise they prepared food. During the day they carried water, cleaned, repaired clothing, cared for children, and assisted with countless tasks. At night they prepared for tomorrow before resting briefly themselves. Their labor often remained unseen compared to monumental building projects or agricultural work, yet Egyptian society depended completely upon these daily routines inside homes. A young mother quietly covered sleeping children with linen cloth after the night breeze strengthened slightly above the rooftop. Nearby, her husband already slept heavily after a day unloading cargo beside the river docks. His breathing sounded rough from exhaustion. Tomorrow he would wake before dawn once more. The pattern repeated endlessly. Across Egypt, thousands of workers slept with the knowledge that darkness would not last long enough. A few precious hours. Then the cycle began again. Farther north, in a larger city near a temple district, musicians played softly during a wealthy family's evening gathering. Harp music drifted gently across the courtyard while servants carried food and wine between shaded rooms lit by dozens of oil lamps. Yet even here, beneath greater comfort, the night remained tied to the rhythms of the natural world. The gathering would not continue until sunrise. The household itself still woke early. Servants needed preparation time before dawn. Markets opened with morning light. Business followed the movement of the sun. Outside the wealthy district, poorer neighborhoods already slept beneath quiet darkness. Rooftops stretched side by side beneath the stars. Some people murmured softly in dreams. Others shifted restlessly against lingering heat trapped in the clay walls below. The smell of smoke and warm dust still drifted through the air. Then slowly, almost unnoticed at first, the deepest part of night arrived. This was the stillest hour. The wind softened. The roads emptied completely. Even the Nile seemed quieter now. For a little while, Egypt rested. But not for long. Near one riverside bakery, a woman stirred awake while stars still filled the sky above the village. She sat up slowly from her woven mat, careful not to wake the sleeping children beside her. Her body felt heavy with tiredness. Yesterday's labor remained in her shoulders and lower back. Still, she stood. She lit a small oil lamp. Its trembling glow filled the darkness around her. Outside, the world remained almost silent. But soon other lights would appear across the village. Other workers rising from sleep. Other ovens warming in the darkness. Other fishermen walking toward the river. The first faint hint of dawn still waited far below the eastern horizon. Yet ancient Egypt was already beginning to wake once again beside the eternal Nile. The woman moved quietly through the darkness of the small bakery while the village still slept around her. The oil lamp in her hand cast soft golden light against the mud brick walls, revealing baskets of grain stacked carefully in the corners and flat wooden boards dusted lightly with flour from the previous day. Outside, the stars remained bright over the Nile Valley. The deepest part of night had not fully passed yet. But for bakers across ancient Egypt, the day had already begun. She knelt beside the grinding stone and poured grain into the hollow center. Then slowly, with practiced movements learned over many years, she pushed the heavy upper stone back and forth. The sound was low and steady. Stone against grain. Again and again. This quiet grinding would soon become one of the first sounds of morning throughout the village. Nearby households would hear it through open windows and rooftop spaces while still half asleep beneath linen cloths. For many Egyptians, that sound meant another day was beginning. The woman's arms already ached from countless mornings exactly like this one. Fine grain dust settled over her hands and clothing while sweat slowly gathered along her forehead despite the coolness of night still lingering outside. Bread required enormous labor before anyone even tasted it. The grain had to be harvested beneath the sun. Carried from the fields. Stored carefully against insects and dampness. Ground into flour by hand. Mixed into dough. Then baked inside ovens that became unbearably hot by sunrise. And because bread fed nearly everyone, this work never stopped. A child stirred quietly nearby on a woven mat, then fell asleep again while the grinding continued in the darkness. Outside, another lamp flickered to life somewhere down the narrow street. Then another. The village was beginning to wake. Near the riverbank, fishermen emerged from their homes carrying rolled nets over their shoulders. The air beside the Nile felt cooler than the dusty roads farther inland. Reeds whispered softly in the faint breeze. Water touched the muddy shore with gentle sounds almost too quiet to hear. One fisherman paused for a moment before stepping into his boat. The stars reflected across the dark water around him. For a brief time before dawn, the Nile belonged mostly to silence. No crowded docks. No shouting merchants. No heavy labor under blazing sunlight. only drifting boats and quiet water beneath the sky. The fisherman pushed away from shore using a long wooden pole while his younger brother settled the nets inside the boat. Both men spoke softly so their voices would not carry across the still river. They had followed this routine since childhood. Wake before sunrise. Fish before the heat arrives. Return before midday. Rest briefly. Then prepare to begin again tomorrow. Ancient Egyptian life moved in circles more than straight lines. The same labor returned every day, shaped only slightly by seasons and flood cycles. Farther inland, farmers slowly rose from rooftop sleeping spaces while the eastern horizon remained dark. Some sat quietly for a few moments after waking, gathering strength before another day in the fields. An old farmer stretched carefully beside his sleeping grandson, trying to ease pain from his stiff lower back. The rooftop beneath him still held traces of coolness from the night air. Soon the stone and clay would begin warming again beneath the sun. He looked toward the east. Still dark. But not for long. Nearby rooftops slowly came alive with movement. Women folded sleeping mats while men rinsed faces with water from clay jars. Children rubbed tired eyes and leaned sleepily against walls. No one appeared fully awake yet. The village existed in a soft half-dream before sunrise. Below, narrow streets remained quiet except for occasional footsteps and the distant sound of grinding stones continuing their steady rhythm. Inside homes, small oil lamps glowed gently beside food baskets, water jars, and folded linen garments. Smoke from early cooking fires drifted upward into the night sky. The smell of baking dough slowly spread through the cool air. This hour before dawn carried a strange peace. The labor of the day had not fully arrived yet. There were still moments where workers could breathe slowly and hear the Nile moving through the darkness beyond the village. Near one canal, a young boy carried water toward his family's home while struggling to stay awake. The clay jar bumped lightly against his leg with each step. Frogs croaked somewhere nearby among the reeds. He would spend the day helping his father repair irrigation channels outside the village. Tomorrow he would likely do the same. And years later, he would probably wake his own children before sunrise beside these same waters. The routines of Egypt changed very slowly across generations. In larger cities, temple servants now moved quietly through enormous stone courtyards still hidden in shadow. They swept dust from sacred pathways and prepared offerings before morning rituals began. The temples looked mysterious before dawn. Tall columns disappeared into darkness overhead. Statues emerged only partially in flickering lamplight. The smell of incense lingered from nighttime ceremonies. A priest walked silently through one hallway carrying a small lamp beside folded linen garments prepared for the sunrise rituals. His sandals brushed softly against the cool stone floor. Even the temples followed the rhythm of early waking. Morning prayers welcomed the return of the sun god Ra each day. The arrival of dawn held deep spiritual meaning throughout Egypt. Light represented order, life, and renewal after darkness. So while farmers prepared for labor and bakers prepared bread, priests prepared sacred ceremonies greeting the sunrise itself. The entire society rose together beneath the stars. Near a large construction site farther north, laborers sleeping inside workers' housing slowly stirred awake as supervisors moved between rooms carrying lamps. Some workers groaned softly while sitting up from hard sleeping mats. Their bodies felt heavy from yesterday's labor. Hands swollen from hauling stone. Shoulders burning from ropes. Legs cramped from climbing ramps beneath the sun. Still, they stood and prepared for another day. A few men ate quickly before leaving. Others wrapped cloth around sore hands before reaching for tools stacked against the walls. Outside the workers' settlement, the desert remained silent and cold compared to the heat that would arrive later. The stars above the quarry looked sharp and endless. Soon these workers would spend hours beneath blinding sunlight reflected from pale limestone surfaces. They knew the morning hours offered their best chance to complete difficult labor before exhaustion settled into every muscle. That was why they woke now. Not from choice, but necessity. Near the Nile docks, merchants arriving early from neighboring villages began arranging cargo before sunrise. Donkeys loaded with baskets stood patiently beside the roads while workers unloaded jars of oil, bundles of linen, and sacks of grain. The air smelled of river mud, damp rope, and smoke drifting from nearby ovens. A scribe sat beside the dock entrance preparing papyrus and ink for the day's records. He yawned heavily while adjusting his reed pens beside the weak glow of a lamp. Even those who escaped physical labor rarely escaped early mornings. Trade began with daylight. Boats moved best during cooler hours. Records needed preparation before the crowds arrived. All of Egypt depended upon careful timing tied to the movement of the sun. Slowly, the eastern horizon began changing color. First gray. Then pale blue. Then faint traces of gold above the desert cliffs. Workers noticed immediately. The stars closest to the horizon disappeared one by one. Birds began calling softly from the reeds beside the Nile. A cool breeze moved across the water and through the waking villages. Morning was coming. In homes across Egypt, the pace of movement increased slightly now. Bread dough was shaped more quickly. Children were called awake. Water jars were lifted onto shoulders. Sandals scraped against packed earth floors. The peaceful stillness before dawn was fading. Soon the roads would fill. The markets would grow noisy. The heat would return. But for these final moments before sunrise, the ancient world still felt gentle and quiet beneath the fading stars. A fisherman drifting on the Nile looked eastward as the first thin line of sunlight appeared beyond the distant cliffs. The water around his boat shimmered softly beneath the growing light. Behind him, Egypt awakened once more. Farmers walked toward fields. Priests entered temple halls. Builders gathered tools. Bakers removed fresh bread from glowing ovens. And across the Nile Valley, countless ordinary people began another long day, because the land itself had taught them, generation after generation, to rise before the sun. The first sunlight touched the Nile slowly, spreading across the water in thin bands of pale gold. Mist lingered lightly above parts of the river where the coolness of night still held for a few final moments. Fishing boats drifted quietly through the early glow while birds lifted from the reeds and circled over the marshes. Morning had arrived again. Across Egypt, thousands of people were already working. The baker who had risen during the deepest darkness now pulled warm loaves from the clay oven using a long wooden paddle. Heat rolled outward from the fire and filled the small room with thick air smelling of grain and smoke. Her arms felt weak already. The day had barely begun. Nearby, stacked baskets waited to carry bread toward markets, fields, and workers' settlements. Some loaves would feed fishermen returning from the river. Others would travel to temple kitchens or construction sites where laborers needed food before the heat grew unbearable. Bread connected every level of Egyptian life. The rich ate it. The poor survived on it. Workers carried it wrapped in cloth during long hours in the fields. Children dipped pieces into stews beside evening fires. And because bread was needed constantly, someone always woke before sunrise to prepare it. Outside the bakery, the narrow village streets now filled steadily with movement. Sandals brushed dust into the morning air while voices rose softly between homes. Donkeys carrying baskets walked toward the markets beside farmers already heading for distant fields. The sky above the Nile brightened quickly now. The softness of dawn would not last long. A fisherman guided his small boat back toward shore after hours on the water before sunrise. Inside the boat, silver fish glistened beneath damp nets while river water dripped quietly from the wooden edges. His younger brother rowed silently. Both men looked tired already, though the day was still young. They would unload the catch, repair damaged nets, rest briefly if possible, and then prepare again for tomorrow's early departure. The routine repeated endlessly. The Nile fed Egypt. But it demanded constant labor in return. Near the riverbank, women washed clothing against smooth stones while speaking quietly together. Their hands moved rhythmically through water darkened with mud and soap made from natural oils and ash. Linen cloth snapped softly in the morning breeze as garments were hung to dry. Children played nearby for a little while before daily responsibilities called them elsewhere. Even childhood beside the Nile followed the rhythm of work. In the farming fields beyond the villages, the early morning coolness still lingered faintly over the soil. Farmers moved quickly now because they understood how little time remained before the sun became harsh again. One man lifted water from an irrigation canal using a wooden shadov, a simple balancing tool that helped carry water into higher channels feeding the crops. The movement was repetitive and exhausting. Lift. Pour. Lower. Lift again. Water splashed against the earth while insects buzzed around the damp soil. Nearby, another farmer guided oxen slowly between rows of grain. The animals snorted heavily in the warming air while birds followed behind searching for insects disturbed by the plow. Morning offered the best chance to accomplish difficult labor before exhaustion settled into the body. This truth shaped nearly every part of Egyptian daily life. Along a dusty road farther north, traders entered a larger city as sunlight spread across temple towers and administrative buildings. Donkeys carried pottery, oil jars, baskets of vegetables, and bundles of woven linen cloth. The city itself was fully waking now. Smoke rose above rooftops. Temple bells sounded softly in the distance. Market sellers arranged goods beneath shaded coverings while early customers moved through the streets. The smell of bread, dust, animals, and river water mixed together in the growing warmth. Inside the city's temple complex, priests completed sunrise rituals within enormous stone halls where incense smoke curled upward toward carved ceilings. Sunlight entered through narrow openings and touched statues of the gods waiting in silence within sacred chambers. The priests believed the rising sun renewed the world each morning. Darkness passed. Light returned. Life continued. Outside the temple walls, ordinary workers likely felt this renewal differently. For them, sunrise meant another day of labor beginning beneath the heat. Yet even exhausting routines carried moments of beauty. The glow of morning light across the Nile. Cool air before dawn. Birdsong rising from the reeds. Fresh bread carried through quiet streets. These small comforts softened difficult lives. Near the center of the city, scribes now settled into long hours of work inside shaded offices lined with papyrus scrolls. One young scribe dipped his reed pen carefully into black ink before recording grain deliveries arriving from southern villages. His fingers moved quickly and neatly across the papyrus. Outside, laborers shouted while unloading cargo beside the docks. Inside, only scratching pens and turning scrolls disturbed the quiet. The scribe's work required education and skill, yet it also demanded discipline shaped around early waking. Administrative life began with sunrise because trade, taxation, construction, and agriculture all depended on daylight hours. No part of Egypt stood separate from the movement of the sun. At a stone quarry beyond the fertile river valley, workers strained against thick ropes attached to heavy limestone blocks. their feet dug into dusty ground while supervisors shouted instructions nearby. The morning air remained cooler than midday, but already sweat covered backs and arms beneath the brightening sky. A laborer paused briefly to drink from a shared water jar before returning to the ropes. His breathing sounded rough from effort. Fine limestone dust coated his face until only the lines around his eyes remained visible. He had risen long before dawn. And still most of the day remained ahead of him. These workers built the monuments that later generations would admire for thousands of years. Yet their own lives were usually simple, exhausting, and short. Many suffered injuries from lifting stone, climbing ramps, or breathing dust daily beneath the Egyptian sun. Morning offered their strongest hours. By midday, the heat would drain nearly everything from the body. In one crowded workshop near the city markets, weavers sat before wooden looms producing linen cloth from flax gathered along the Nile. Threads stretched tightly between wooden beams while hands moved steadily through practiced motions. The room smelled of plant fibers, warm dust, and human sweat. Sunlight entered through small openings high in the walls, creating narrow golden beams drifting through floating fibers in the air. One elderly weaver blinked tired eyes and adjusted stiff fingers before continuing her work. Her back curved forward permanently after years seated beside the loom. Still, she continued. Because work continued. That was life beside the Nile. Near the markets, children carried trays of bread or jars of beer through crowded streets while avoiding donkeys and carts. Sellers called softly from shaded stalls offering onions, fish, figs, sandals, pottery, and oils. The markets grew louder as morning advanced. More boats arrived. More customers appeared. More dust rose into the air. Yet the city still carried traces of early morning calm before the full weight of midday heat descended once again. In wealthier homes, servants completed morning cleaning while noble families ate breakfast in shaded courtyards. Water cooled stone floors slightly while palm leaves moved above quiet pools. But even here, schedules followed the same ancient rhythm. Wake early. Work early. Avoid the worst heat when possible. Rest briefly. Then continue again. The climate itself shaped every social class. Farther south beside a quiet stretch of the Nile, an old woman sat outside her home sorting lentils into baskets while watching sunlight brighten the river. Her grandchildren had already left with their parents for field work. For a little while, she sat alone in the peaceful morning air. She listened to water moving against reeds. To distant voices drifting from the village. To birds calling overhead. Her hands moved slowly through the lentils while the sun climbed higher above the eastern sky. She had lived through countless mornings exactly like this one. Countless dawns beside the Nile. Countless early wakings before sunrise. The rhythms of Egypt rarely changed quickly. Generations passed. Kings rose and disappeared. Temples expanded. Cities grew. Yet ordinary people continued waking in darkness because the land itself demanded it. And as the bright morning slowly moved toward another long afternoon of heat and labor, Egypt carried on beneath the sun exactly as it had for centuries beside the eternal river. As the morning moved steadily toward midday, the coolness that had lingered over the Nile disappeared almost completely. The sunlight grew brighter and flatter above the valley, pouring across rooftops, open fields, temple courtyards, and crowded streets without mercy. The day was becoming heavy again. Workers felt it first in their shoulders and backs. Then in their breathing. Then in the slow tiredness that settled into every movement. In the farming villages, the smell of wet earth from the irrigation canals mixed with warming dust beneath the sun. Farmers continued lifting water into narrow channels feeding grain fields and vegetable gardens beside the Nile. The work demanded patience more than speed. One man stood ankle-deep in mud while adjusting a small canal wall built from packed earth and reeds. Water slipped through a weak section, spreading slowly into the wrong field. He pressed fresh mud into the opening using both hands while flies gathered around the damp ground nearby. His linen garment clung heavily to his skin now. The morning strength he had carried before sunrise was already fading beneath the heat. Still, the fields needed attention. They always needed attention. The Nile gave fertility to the land, but only through constant labor. Canals collapsed. Flood patterns shifted. Soil dried quickly once the sun climbed overhead. Entire harvests depended on careful daily work performed by ordinary people whose names history would never remember. Nearby, a young girl carried a basket of onions from the field toward a shaded storage area beside her family's home. She walked slowly through the rising heat while dust collected against her feet and ankles. She had been awake since before dawn. Her mother had already baked bread. Her father had already worked hours beside the canals. Even the children followed the rhythm of early waking because family survival depended upon everyone contributing something. Along the Nile, boats drifted steadily beneath widening sunlight. Fishermen returning from the river sorted catches along the docks while merchants argued softly over prices beside stacks of cargo waiting for transport inland. The river smelled of wet reeds, fish, rope, and mud warming beneath the day. Boatmen wiped sweat from their foreheads while securing heavy jars with thick cords against wooden decks. Some boats traveled north carrying grain. Others moved south transporting stone, cloth, or pottery. The Nile remained Egypt's great moving road. Without it, much of the land would have become silent desert. Near one busy dock, a laborer bent beneath the weight of a grain sack balanced across his shoulders. He walked carefully along a narrow wooden plank leading from boat to shore while a supervisor counted shipments nearby. His breathing sounded strained. The sack rubbed painfully against his neck. But he continued forward because many more waited behind him. Around him, the dock slowly grew louder as morning advanced. Voices echoed over the water. Animals brayed beside supply carts. Wood creaked beneath shifting cargo. Yet beneath the growing noise existed a deep exhaustion shared by nearly everyone there. Most had already been awake for many hours. Inside city markets, the warmth thickened between narrow streets lined with stalls and awnings. Merchants shaded their goods beneath woven coverings while customers moved more slowly now than they had earlier in the morning. The market smelled rich and crowded. Fresh bread. Dry herbs. Fish laid over damp cloth. Oil warming in clay jars. Sweat drifting through dusty air. Children carried trays of food between stalls while stray dogs searched beneath tables for scraps. A woman selling figs fanned herself gently with a palm leaf while watching the sunlight creep farther beneath her awning. Even the shadows felt warm now. In one corner of the market, an elderly sandal maker sat cross-legged beside pieces of leather and woven fibers. His fingers moved carefully despite stiff joints and failing eyesight. Years of labor had bent his back and thickened his hands. Still, he worked each morning because there was little choice. Ancient Egyptian life allowed very few people to stop working entirely, even in old age. Food cost labor. Water cost labor. Shelter cost labor. Everything depended on daily effort repeated beneath the sun. Near the center of the city, scribes continued their work inside shaded buildings where servants occasionally poured water across floors to cool the air slightly. Papyrus scrolls rested in careful stacks beside ink palettes and reed pens. One scribe paused briefly and flexed cramped fingers before continuing a grain inventory report. Sweat gathered at his temples despite the shade. Outside, the city baked beneath bright sunlight. Inside, the air remained dim and still. The scribe could hear distant market sounds drifting faintly through narrow windows high in the walls. Though his work spared him the brutal physical strain of field labor or stone hauling, it carried its own exhaustion. Long hours of concentration, constant writing, and endless record-keeping wore slowly upon the body. And like everyone else, he had risen before dawn. At the temple complexes, priests moved quietly through sacred halls carrying offerings for midday rituals. The enormous stone walls helped hold back some of the outside heat, though warmth still crept gradually into the chambers. Incense smoke drifted slowly upward through shafts of sunlight cutting across the darkness. Temple servants swept floors and polished sacred objects while distant prayers echoed gently between the columns. For many ordinary Egyptians, the temples represented stability in a difficult world. The rituals repeated every day with careful precision. Sunrise ceremonies, midday offerings, evening prayers. The gods remained steady while human lives passed beneath them. Outside the temple gates, workers rested briefly against shaded walls eating bread and onions before returning to labor. Some drank beer from clay cups while staring silently toward the bright streets. Their conversations grew shorter in the heat. Words required energy too. Farther from the cities, at a limestone quarry near the desert cliffs, the sunlight reflected painfully from pale stone surfaces. Workers hauling blocks across packed earth roads squinted against the brightness while dust coated their bodies almost completely. A water carrier moved between crews balancing heavy jars across his shoulders. The workers gathered around quickly, drinking deeply before returning to the ropes. Without constant water, the heat could become deadly. Even so, many workers likely suffered headaches, dizziness, or fever during the hottest months. Ancient Egyptian medicine understood some treatments for heat sickness and exhaustion, but prevention mattered most. That was why work began before sunrise. Morning offered protection. Not comfort exactly, but survival. Near one work ramp, a laborer stumbled briefly from exhaustion before catching himself against the side of a stone block. His supervisor watched carefully but said nothing. Everyone there understood fatigue. The entire construction site moved with the slow rhythm of tired bodies pushing through another hot day. In nearby workers' housing, women prepared simple midday meals over small fires while infants slept in shaded corners of the rooms. Smoke drifted upward through openings in the roof while older children carried water from communal wells. The home smelled of warm clay, bread, and ash. Inside one small room, an old grandmother repaired torn linen clothing while speaking softly to a child beside her. The woman's hands trembled slightly with age, but her movements remained practiced and careful. Life in Egypt depended not only on grand labor in fields and quarries, but also on these quiet daily tasks performed inside ordinary homes. Clothing needed repair. Food needed preparation. Water needed carrying. Children needed care. And all of it began before dawn because the heat later in the day made every task more difficult. As the sun climbed even higher overhead, the roads outside the villages began emptying slightly. Travelers searched for shade beneath palm trees or roadside shelters. Donkeys stood motionless beside carts while their owners rested nearby. The air itself seemed slower now. The brightness softened edges until distant buildings shimmered above the heated ground. Along the Nile, the water reflected white light so intensely that fishermen covered their eyes while rowing. Birds hid among the reeds. Dogs slept beneath market tables. Even insects seemed quieter beneath the afternoon heat. Yet somewhere, already, bakers were thinking about tomorrow morning's bread. Fishermen were planning tomorrow's nets. Farmers were watching water levels for tomorrow's irrigation. The cycle never paused. Ancient Egypt moved forward through endless repetition guided by sunlight, river water, and human endurance. And as midday settled heavily across the valley once more, countless tired workers quietly remembered the cool darkness before dawn, when the world had briefly felt gentle beside the Nile. Midday stretched slowly across Egypt, and the land seemed to sink deeper into heat with every passing hour. The sunlight above the Nile Valley had turned almost white now, flattening colors beneath its brightness. Temple walls glowed pale beneath the sky. Dusty roads shimmered in the distance. The river itself reflected light so sharply that boatmen narrowed their eyes while guiding vessels through the current. For those working since before dawn, the body now carried a deep and steady exhaustion. Not sudden. Not dramatic. Only heavy. The kind of tiredness that settled quietly into the muscles and remained there. In the farming fields, men paused beside irrigation canals while warm wind moved gently through rows of grain. Some rested crouched beneath small patches of shade cast by date palms. Others sat silently on the ground eating pieces of bread softened with water. No one lingered long. The work still waited. A farmer lifted muddy water from a canal using a shaduf while sweat rolled slowly down his arms. The wooden beam creaked softly each time he lowered and raised the bucket. Lift. Pour. Lower again. The movement repeated endlessly beneath the sun. His hands had become thick and rough from years of gripping wood and rope. The skin across his shoulders had darkened after decades spent outdoors. Even his posture carried the shape of labor, bent slightly forward from endless seasons working beside the Nile. Still, tomorrow before sunrise, he would wake again. Like his father. Like his grandfather. The rhythm continued through generations. Nearby, a young child slept beneath a cloth shelter stretched between poles at the edge of the field while insects buzzed lazily nearby. The child's mother continued gathering vegetables farther down the row, occasionally glancing back toward the sleeping figure. Life and labor existed side by side in ancient Egypt. Children grew among tools, baskets, nets, ovens, and fields. They learned routines before they fully understood them. By the time they reached adulthood, the body already knew how to wake before dawn without needing thought. The Nile taught these habits early. Along the riverbanks, fishermen cleaned nets beneath woven reed shelters while the afternoon heat pressed heavily against the water. Fish scales glittered faintly beside overturned baskets and damp ropes. The men spoke little now. One fisherman sat quietly repairing torn fibers while staring out toward the bright river current. His younger companion drank slowly from a clay cup beside him, trying to conserve energy beneath the warmth. Morning had felt easier. It always did. The river breeze before sunrise carried softness with it. Even difficult work seemed manageable while the sky remained pale and cool. But midday tested everyone. Near the docks of a larger city, laborers unloading grain moved more slowly than they had earlier in the day. Their shoulders sagged beneath heavy sacks. Dust from spilled grain mixed with sweat across their skin. A supervisor stood nearby beneath a shaded covering while scribes recorded shipments onto papyrus scrolls. The scribes themselves appeared tired now. One man wiped his forehead carefully before dipping his reed pen back into ink. Heat crept even into shaded administrative rooms during these hours. The air inside became thick and still. Outside the building, market sounds drifted faintly through narrow openings in the walls. Voices. Animal calls. The scrape of carts across stone. Ancient Egyptian cities never fully fell silent during the day, but midday changed their energy. Movements slowed. Conversations shortened. People conserved strength wherever possible. In the crowded markets, merchants rested beside their goods while waiting for customers willing to brave the heat. Fish sellers sprinkled water over their catches to keep them cool a little longer. Bread vendors rearranged loaves beneath cloth coverings to protect them from flies and dust. The smell of the market deepened beneath the warmth. Dry spices, warm grain, animal sweat, smoke drifting from cooking fires. One elderly woman selling onions leaned back against a mud brick wall while fanning herself slowly with woven reeds. Her eyes remained half-closed as she listened to the dull hum of the marketplace around her. She had likely spent most of her life waking before sunrise. Most Egyptians did. The climate encouraged it. The labor demanded it. And over time, the body accepted it almost as naturally as breathing. Far beyond the city walls, the desert stretched motionless beneath the afternoon sky. Pale cliffs overlooked the fertile Nile Valley while heat waves shimmered above rocky ground. At a quarry near these cliffs, workers continued cutting limestone from the earth despite the brutal conditions. Bronze tools struck stone with dull rhythmic sounds that echoed across the open landscape. Dust floated constantly through the air. A laborer paused briefly to wrap cloth around his face against the brightness and stone powder. Nearby, another group strained together against thick ropes dragging a large block toward wooden sledges waiting farther downhill. Their feet slipped against loose gravel. Their breathing sounded rough and tired. Water jars rested beneath a shaded covering nearby, guarded carefully because every drop mattered during the hottest hours. Many of these workers likely suffered constant injuries. Cut hands, burned skin, damaged joints, back pain that never fully disappeared. Yet construction continued season after season because Egypt's monuments required enormous human effort hidden behind their beauty. And those workers survived by beginning before sunrise whenever possible. Morning gave them a small advantage against the land itself. In workers' settlements beside the quarry, women prepared midday meals while children rested indoors away from the harsh sunlight. Smoke drifted through narrow openings above cooking fires while lentils simmered slowly inside clay pots. Inside one small home, an old man slept lightly beside the wall while flies buzzed near the doorway. His body remained thin and worn from decades of labor. Even in sleep, his hands twitched slightly as though still gripping tools. The room smelled of warm dust, smoke, and bread. Outside, the village remained strangely quiet beneath the afternoon heat. Dogs slept in patches of shade. Donkeys stood motionless beside carts. Palm leaves barely moved in the still air. The entire land seemed to breathe more slowly. Near the temples, priests continued their daily rituals despite the rising warmth. Incense drifted upward through shadowed halls while servants carried offerings through cool stone corridors. The temples felt different from the outside world. Darker. Quieter. Protected. Inside these sacred spaces, sunlight entered carefully through narrow openings, creating soft beams across carved walls covered with painted scenes of gods, kings, rivers, birds, and stars. For ordinary Egyptians exhausted by labor, temples may have offered moments of calm rare within daily life. A place where voices softened. Where stone remained cool. Where rituals repeated with comforting certainty. Outside the temple gates, however, the brightness still waited. Near a riverside road farther south, a traveling merchant rested beneath a palm tree beside two tired donkeys loaded with baskets and rolled linen cloth. The man drank slowly from a water jar while staring toward the distant river. Travel during midday felt difficult and dangerous. Many travelers planned their journeys carefully around temperature and sunlight. Early morning departures remained common because the land became far less forgiving after noon. Even the animals suffered beneath the heat. The donkeys' sides rose heavily while flies gathered around their eyes. Still, once evening arrived, the journey would continue again. Everything in Egypt moved according to the sun. As the long afternoon carried on, faint changes slowly appeared in the light. Shadows deepened slightly beside walls and trees. Breezes from the Nile returned in gentle movements through the reeds. Workers noticed immediately. The worst heat would eventually pass. A fisherman sitting beside the river lifted his face toward the wind and closed tired eyes for a moment. The breeze smelled faintly of water and mud cooling beneath the sunlight. Small comforts mattered deeply in ancient Egypt. Cool air. Shade. Fresh water. Moments of silence after labor. And somewhere beyond the bright western horizon, evening waited patiently for the tired people of the Nile, just as dawn would eventually return once more to wake them before sunrise again. As evening slowly returned across the Nile Valley, the light softened one final time over the ancient land. The heat that had ruled the day began to loosen its grip upon the fields, the temples, the dusty roads, and the quiet riverbanks. Palm trees swayed gently in the cooling breeze. Boats drifted slowly toward shore. Smoke rose softly from cooking fires beside mud brick homes. Workers returned home beneath skies painted gold and deep amber. Their sandals brushed against warm earth. Their shoulders ached from long labor. Their eyes felt heavy with tiredness gathered across another ancient day. Along the Nile, fishermen pulled in their final nets while birds circled low above the reeds. Farmers washed dust from their hands beside irrigation canals before stepping quietly into narrow village streets. Bakers removed the last warm loaves from glowing ovens as darkness slowly approached. The sounds of Egypt softened little by little. Market voices faded. Tools were set aside. Animals settled for the night. Children drifted to sleep beside their families beneath the open sky. And above it all, the stars began appearing once more over the river. The same stars that watched the pyramids rise. The same stars that reflected softly across the Nile thousands of years ago. One by one, oil lamps flickered gently inside homes across the valley. Their warm light glowed against clay walls while families gathered close after the long heat of the day. Quiet conversations drifted through open windows. Somewhere far away, water moved softly through reeds in the darkness. Ancient Egypt rested. Not completely. Never completely. Some fishermen still floated beneath the moonlight. Some priests still walked silently through temple halls. Some bakers already prepared grain for tomorrow morning before dawn returned again. But most of the land grew calm. And as the cool night breeze moved gently across the eternal Nile, tired workers closed their eyes beneath the stars, knowing that somewhere beyond the dark eastern horizon, another sunrise would someday come softly over the river once again. For now, though, the fields were quiet. The boats were still. The temples stood silent beneath the night sky. And history itself slowly drifted into sleep beside the calm waters of ancient Egypt.